Populism has become the most distinct political institution in European politics. More and more people feel that they need a different form of representation. We see the near death of the Tory-Labour duopoly. That reform is not a protest party in the way that it's often represented. Populism is not a protest movement. It's a movement that has got much greater moral and intellectual depth.
Of more leftish economic populism, whereas what we have now is a populism that is really about rescuing the fundamental values of life itself.
The populist movement is essentially concerned about family, it's rooted in concern about a community, and it's this concern with pre-political life, which they feel is being colonized by alien forces, that gives a certain strength and moral depth to the populist message.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest today, Frank Furedi. Frank, welcome to the show.
Nice to be talking to you.
Great to have you on. You've got another book out. I don't know if this is your 25th book, your 30th book. I've lost track, but you've got another book out, and it's a brilliant book called In Defence of Populism. Much needed challenge to the anti-populist consensus. I highly recommend it. There's a lot to talk about in relation to populism. There's a lot of questions I've got about the book itself, but I want to kick off by asking you about the local elections in England, the parliamentary elections in Wales and Scotland, especially Wales, where Labour was completely trounced. What have you made of those elections in relation to your thesis about populism and the fact that it's not dead yet? What have you made of what's been happening in England, Scotland and Wales?
Well, I think most importantly, we see the decline, almost the near death of the Tory-Labour duopoly. I mean, the days when these two parties could just dominate public life are gone. And I think what has happened is that as these parties have declined, so more and more people feel that they need a different form of representation. They first expressed that back in 2016 around the Brexit referendum. And in the last decade, what you saw was more and more people are prepared to raise issues, finding their voice, indicating that they're looking for something that's very different than the kind of top-down political technocratic vision that's promoted through the mainstream media. So I think what the elections showed is that there's a very clear bloc that has emerged in the last decade, a bloc of people, maybe 30% of the population, who are now thinking in roughly the similar kind of way and are demanding to be heard. They basically want the old Britain back, maybe in a new form. They're not prepared to put up with all these top-down values. And I think what has happened in Britain, as in many parts of Europe, is you have the situation where there's a demand for a new form of representation. Reform is the main beneficiary of that. But it's important to make a distinction between the demand for a populist representative and the people that eventually emerge and become the representative. There's a kind of potential tension there. But what's really nice and important here is that that demand for a new kind of representative institution is there, it's stable, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. And I think it's important to realize that reform is not a protest party in the way that it's often represented. Populism is not a protest movement. It's a movement that has got much greater moral and intellectual depth. And I think anybody that simply sees it as a temporary phenomenon will discover 4 or 5 years from that they are utterly wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that, because the phrase that's been getting on my nerves over the past couple of weeks is protest vote, because you just look at the vote for reform and the huge swing to reform that we've seen over the past, not just in this election, but in recent elections, especially in Labour heartlands. And you realise that this is more than a protest vote. This is, as you say, a people trying to rediscover their voice. So I want to come on to some of the themes in the book, but I guess just as a follow-on question to that, it's interesting because populism was seen by many people as a flash in the pan. It was seen as a protest, and Brexit was seen, people often say, the cry of the left behind, almost as if it was just a wail of pain by, communities that had been forgotten. Lots of people thought it would peter out. I thought it had more longevity to it, but even I thought, maybe at some point it's going to peter out, especially given the anti-populist backlash from the technocratic elites. I thought at some point populism is going to wither or be defeated, but it turns out that it's actually quite strong. And given what you've just said about the local elections and what they reveal about the UK, do you think populism is now, in some ways, the key phenomenon in European politics right now?
It is. I mean, populism has become the most distinct political institution in European politics. It wasn't the case in the past when you had the beginnings of populist movements, but today, if you look at Europe, you'll find that roughly 30%, anywhere between 25 and 30% of the population will always vote for a populist party. You'll find that there is a growing tendency, even except Britain is an exception to this, for young people who have traditionally moved to the left are moving to the national populist section of society. So it's very, very exciting what happens. So you take something like Portugal, where you have Chega party. Chega means enough. And the party's only been around for 2 years, and now it's the main opposition party. And it's the party that most young people support. So I think that what we've seen is a situation where, as the mainstream legacy parties evaporate and decline and lose their base and can no longer count on the support of their traditional supporters, so populism has become more and more entrenched. And I think that often people mistakenly believe that just because a particular populist party doesn't do well in a local election or loses a seat in a parliamentary election, that's the end of populism. This is what they said about the loss of the Orban government in Hungary. This is the beginning of the end. They overlook the fact that, okay, parties can come and go, but the demand for populism, for populist representation, remains remarkably stable.
Yeah, that's a very striking phenomenon. Okay, I want to talk to you about, there's a lot I want to ask you in relation to your book and what populism represents, but I guess it'd be worth talking about its origins, where it comes from, and what are the kind of seeds for populism. So there's a really interesting bit in the book where you talk about the elite's double betrayal of the people, the two significant ways in which the elites stabbed the people in the back, essentially, in the 60s, and then in the response to the 60s. Could you just outline a little bit what you mean about the double betrayal of the people and why you think that was so significant to what we're going through now?
The double betrayal of the people refers to the fact that sometimes in the 70s, the elites, the political and cultural elites of most European societies, gave up on the values into which they were socialized, rejected those sentiments that were integral to their nation's political culture, and began not only to give up on them, but also to react against them. And in that sense, they adopted a political posture where they simply refused to engage with the population politically. And instead of politically engaging with them, they've adopted a very kind of technocratic managerial approach, where they believe that they're going to adopt these new values, which they're going to shove down the throat of the people, whether they like it or not. And then the second dimension of this betrayal is the fact that the left, and particularly the mainstream left, who has traditionally represented working people, the socialists, the communists throughout Europe, this left decided in the late 70s that they no longer believed in left-wing ideas, that being a leftist was now out of date. Many of them almost overnight became environmentalists. They adopted green politics. Others decided to opt for identity politics. And then all these identity movements that we've seen since has become their main focus. And with the loss of your left-wing representative, you had a situation where people throughout Europe, Britain included, were left without any kind of representation, where their values, the basic traditional values into which they were born into, which really meant something to them, was being regarded increasingly as marginal, as no longer mainstream to British society. And this kind of political cultural betrayal is very, very important because it created a situation where people had to start looking around for a voice because that was no longer available to them. So I think that's the origin. I could just say one other thing occurs at this time, is what's called the cultural turn in the late 70s. What the cultural turn means is the rejection of the traditions of a British or European society, the traditions to do with the history of that society, its rituals, its beliefs, all the things that are, make really are central to the creation of Britishness or Frenchness, being regarded as passé. And the cultural term basically says we're not interested in material values, we're not interested in economics, we're not interested in tradition. We got all these wonderful new values like sustainability, like inclusion, like multiculturalism. And with this cultural turn, what you have is the imposition of a way of life from top down that is increasingly experienced as alien and threatening by millions of people throughout Europe. That's the origin. That's the moment when national populism is born.
All of us at Spike love Rod Liddell, and if you're listening to this podcast, we're pretty certain you'll love him too. Every Saturday morning from 10 a.m., Rod takes over Times Radio for 3 hours of spiky conversation, humor, and opinion, always confronting topics head on. Rod poses the big questions to big name interviewees, ones that won't just give you the line you've heard everywhere else. And it's not all heavy lifting. You'll also get music recommendations from leading artists and the weekly TV review that tells you exactly what to watch and what to avoid. Join Rod Liddell on Times Radio Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. on digital radio, on your smart speaker, or by downloading the free Times Radio app. Yeah, and it's really well outlined in the book. It's a very interesting section. And that's one of the reasons, isn't it, why the populism we have today is so, you call it the spectre haunting Europe in a flashback to Marx and Engels. I think one of the reasons it's such a fundamental movement in terms of having gripped the imagination of so many ordinary people and become the means through which they're trying to rediscover their voice, it's because it really does touch on everyday life. It touches on the values through which we live our lives. And you mentioned in the book that there are populist movements in history going back to the 19th century. I mean, they were often concerned, it was often economic populism or populism to do with, we need better paying conditions, a kind of more leftish economic populism. Whereas what we have now is a populism that is really about rescuing the fundamental values of life itself from this kind of overbearing, the cultural overlords, as you describe them. So it really it touches on the fundamentals of society, doesn't it?
Yes, and in the book I describe populism as being principally about it's a defensive movement that's aware of cultural loss. It's very concerned about cultural loss, but it is committed to cultural rescue. It basically wants to reappropriate many of the cultural values that are at the risk of disappearing from society. And one of the most interesting things, it took me ages to understand this, is that the populist movement is essentially a movement that's rooted in what we call pre-political life. So it's rooted in concern about family, it's rooted in concern about a community, it's rooted in concern about relationships. It's all pre-political, which aren't the stuff in which mainstream politics is concerned. And it's this concern with pre-political life, which they feel is being colonized by alien forces, that gives a certain strength and moral depth to the populist message. People really intensely feel that the kind of life that they want to lead is being threatened, intensely feel that that's at risk of being lost. It is that which gives the energy to what in the book I describe as the spirit of populism.
Yeah, it's absolutely. You can feel that in the way in which these populist movements represent themselves, in way in which this politics plays out. You talk in the book, you mentioned their loss and that sense of loss, and you talk in the book about the spirit of loss, which informs populism, but also the spirit of hope, and you kind of address those two issues. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the spirit of loss in terms of how deep that runs. So when you talk about the pre-political, what kind of institutions are you talking about? What kind of, I mean, there's the family, there's all these kind of very fundamental things, But how deep does that spirit of loss run, do you think? And what do you think was the breaking point for people to think, actually, we need to turn this spirit of loss into a spirit of hope?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that the spirit of loss is often focused on the phenomenon of solidarity. It's focused on what I call in the book the quest for a home, where people feel that their homeland, their physical and emotional home, is at risk of being lost. And it's an attempt to almost kind of consciously find a place that is your place in the world, a place that organically connects you to your community and to the generations that preceded you, a place that connects you to the next generation. So your children aren't just thrown into this world, without having any roots, but can be deeply rooted within the terrain of that home that you're inhabiting. So this quest for a home is really very important. And in the 19th century, by analogy, this phenomenon was often understood and expressed through concepts like alienation, estrangement, anomie. These would be the words that people would use, where you become estranged from your own community. When today, this sense of powerlessness, this sense of estrangement is more robust, it's more powerful than it was in the 19th century, because in the 19th century, you still had the celebration of solidarity. Whereas in today's society, solidarity by the elites is regarded as a threat. Solidarity is often seen as discriminating against people who are not part of that solidarity. Solidarity runs against the ethos of multiculturalism, which basically refuses to allow communities to have a distinct, homogeneous response to their experience. It wants to introduce other kind of people, other kind of cultures into it, supposedly to make it better.
And just touching on that very question, what role do you think the immigration issue plays in weakening people's sense of home and sense that they have a spiritual place or a physical spiritual place where they belong in a meaningful way? Because immigration is a huge issue for populist movements and populist-minded people all around Europe. It was really interesting to see Operation Raise the Colours in parts all across England last summer, where very spontaneously people were just hoisting up the St. George's flag or the UK flag, and that was understood by the elites as an anti-immigration sentiment or an anti-minority sentiment. As you say, they feel terrified by any display of solidarity. To what extent has immigration fueled this or exacerbated this, and does that in that case make sense that immigration has become such a flashpoint issue for populists?
Yes, I think that immigration in the specific form of a multicultural dynamic is very much seen as a problem. So the problem is not the immigrant. The problem is multiculturalism, because what multiculturalism suggests is that communities that are heterogeneous, that are diverse, to use their language, are morally superior to communities that are homogeneous. So basically what they're saying is that this small town in northern England, or this small village in the southeast of the country, which is relatively homogeneous because it's principally inhabited by people who are very similar, who've known each other, who lived in that place for a long time, that kind of community, because it's homogeneous, is morally inferior to a community that has got loads of immigrants, people from different ethnicity and culture, because there's this prejudice that suggests that the more diverse a community is, the better it is. I mean, that's what you learn in school. That's what is being preached by the churches. That's what politicians say. But there's no reason why homogeneity is morally inferior to heterogeneity. They're both terms of description rather than of values. And I think what has happened is that a lot of people feel that their way of life is being devalued through immigration and multiculturalism, because they're being told that those communities that are full of immigrants are the desirable norm. They are what want every community to become, whereas your community is really a community that lives in the past. And the faster we eradicate your homogeneous community and introduce this diverse sort of ethos, the better for everybody.
Without wanting to get into murky territory, how conscious is the play of immigration in this atmosphere that you describe? I mean, you will be familiar with terms like the great replacement theory, and this idea that some people have, that it's all by design, it's all intentional. They're bringing people in precisely in order to transform the country, weaken its national heritage, piss off white people, whatever the theory might be. That is how a lot of people, some people rather, understand it. In your book on borders a few years ago, another book I highly recommend, you do talk about how the refugee, in quote marks, has come to symbolize that kind of instinct amongst the elites to erode borders, weaken claims of national territory, transform communities for the better in order to make them more diverse, etc. Is there a consciousness to this? I mean, I don't think it's a grand conspiracy in the way that other people do, but what is the driving force behind, the relatively modern phenomenon of nation states saying we don't care about our borders very much and we want to be as diverse as possible?
Well, chronologically, the impulse towards mass migration as an elite policy was driven by economics. The European elites and also in Britain have decided that in order to compensate for their labor shortages and for their low productivity, instead of investing in new technology, will bring in a lot of migrants into the country and hopefully stabilize economic life through that. That was the initial reaction. I think since then, when immigration and the support for immigration acquired a quasi-religious quality, where it's seen as a good in and of itself, and where young people are socialized right from the very beginning to believe that a diverse society is what's required, you have gradually an ideological commitment towards migration, mass migration, and even illegal migration, not recognizing there's a distinction between migration and illegal migration. Sometimes this is promoted, but promoted for political reasons. I think it's fairly rare, but there's some very important examples of the way that migration has become politicized. So you will know, for example, that recently the Spanish government has announced that 500,000 illegal migrants will become Spanish overnight. And I think it's very clear that one of the reasons why the socialists are so keen to turn people that come from an alien culture and an alien way of life, who've come illegally into Spain, to turn them into full-blooded Spaniards, is because it extends and enhances their voting base. So there you have a conscious attempt to use immigrants as a way of building a base of support. And there are other examples that one can think of that are occurring in Germany, for example. But by and large, I think that there are what I call spontaneous drivers of mass migration. And then there are much more kind of intentional commitment to use the migrant as a political medium for consolidating your position.
Yeah, that very well put. You talk in the book about how populism, as you've just been saying now as well, that populism is the most important political movement in Europe right now, and I think a lot of listeners to this podcast will agree with that. And you talk about its dynamism, the influence it's having on communities, on new parties, all sorts of incredibly interesting and exciting things are happening as a consequence of national populism. And you contrast it with the malaise and the stagnation of the kind of legacy parties, the two-party duopoly in Britain's case, who all seem a bit knackered. I found that convincing, but then it also made me think about, it made me wonder about how much influence the stagnant side of affairs still has. So if you think, for example, about Operation Raise the Colours, that was a very dynamic movement. It was ordinary people raising the flag in defiance of an establishment that thinks it's racist to raise the flag. But then the pushback against it from the media establishment, from popular culture, it was intense and in its own way very influential. And you see that in various different ways where populism asserts itself, makes a claim to rediscovering voice, re-establishing home, and then the pushback against it from the establishment can often be quite severe. And you talk in the book about anti-populist propaganda, the anti-populist movement from the technocratic elites. So where does the balance of power lie in relation to populism's dynamism? I think is undoubted, but where does the balance of power lie in relation to populism versus anti-populist in Europe?
Well, at the moment, it's unresolved. At the moment, there are limits to the populist surge. It's around 30% of the electorate, which is still quite formidable and impressive given where it kind of comes from. But there are limits. I think the real limit is the fact that elite political culture is still able to exercise hegemony, principally through its control of cultural institutions. So you have to remember that the old elites, the legacy elites, controls the institutions of education. They control the various cultural institutions and the media in particular. And I think as a result of that, they've been able to have a hegemonic influence in terms of the dominant narrative. So the dominant narrative in our society is one where a commitment to multiculturalism is seen as being more powerful than a commitment to a community. We live in a world where, for example, diversity is automatically accepted as a good in and of itself, and people that challenge, in fact, they very rarely challenge diversity explicitly. I think the key problem that we have, if you would like to see populism gain more traction and establish a more solid presence in society, is the absence of a populist intelligentsia, or relative absence of that. One of the problems that we have is that there are very few writers, artists, intellectuals, sort of people in the pop music world, in the media, who identify and see themselves as voices for the populist bloc. I think that's the key problem to solve. It's a problem that paradoxically Gramsci dealt with in Italy. The Italian Marxist Gramsci, who wrote a lot about how what he called the Italian intelligentsia needs to become much more on the side of the people if any real momentum will be achieved. And I think that's a problem that we have today. I mean, one of the things that I urge in private for a lot of young people who identify with the populist movement is to become teachers. Right? It's quite important that young people adopt these kinds of professions, because that's how we can begin to influence culture.
One thing, Frank, I wanted to touch on with you in relation to the influence of the cultural establishment. I mean, I think for a lot of populists, that's something that can feel very frustrating. And when I talk to people, including people who vote for reform or people who support the farmers' uprisings that you also write about, in fact, you open with the farmers' uprisings in your book, people will often say, there's only so much we can do because everything is so entrenched. And they talk about education, they talk about their kids, what their kids are being taught about trans and the problem of the nuclear family and all these other things that are, really rooted prejudices now in the cultural establishment. You say that, we need a more populist intelligentsia, more populist influence in that sphere. But it does seem to some people to be a quite insurmountable problem. And I guess my question is, could that give rise to a real conflict between the political realm, where ordinary people are asserting themselves much more in their quest for home, their quest for a voice, between the political realm and the cultural realm? Do you foresee a kind of clash in those two spheres potentially?
Possibly, yeah, but I see a bigger problem. And the problem is that if people feel that they live in a world where the values that dominate are antithetical to theirs, where they feel that their children are being brainwashed with sentiments that they really don't like, I think very often that kind of provokes a backlash. And you often see, particularly in the United States, you often see a backlash. And whenever people are participating in a backlash, they often lose their sense of perspective. And instead of initiating populist politics and new populist adventures, they react to the terms in which the discussion is set. And that is sometimes a bit of a problem. I think it's a problem in the United States very often where, for example, in opposition to the Democratic Party trying to control their children in schools, instead of taking on the arguments of the teachers, there's a call to ban books in the libraries, which I think is very unhelpful. So we don't need backlash. What we need is a much more strident opposition. And it seems to me that the way that we overcome this difficulty that you allude to, where you feel that somehow the issue of culture seems to be almost unmanageable by almost beyond influence. I think the way around it is when people, sort of raise their voice. I think the 30% blog that I described, if more and more people in that blog began to demand that people pay attention to them and express their views very vociferously and systematically, particularly if you're a parent within a school environment, then I'm sure that you can shake up the confidence of the cultural elites, because at the moment they're only outwardly confident. Deep inside, they are really worried about what they see. I mean, they are really worried about the results of the council elections, and in many respects, they're still traumatized by events like Brexit. I mean, the so-called Remainers, when you talk to them, are almost feel emotionally at a loss that they have been rejected by these people, these uneducated people, who somehow they cannot control.
Yeah, I hear that from people all the time. And in fact, next month is the 10th anniversary of the vote for Brexit, and they're still not over it. I mean, they still traumatized is a good way to describe it. That brings me on to something I wanted to ask you about, the way in which populism is seen by the establishment. You've got lots of good sections in the books about how it's conceived of almost as a disease, as this kind of pox that is spreading amongst ordinary people. Certainly as something dangerous, as something borderline fascistic. I mean, the anti-populist propaganda has been just going off the rails over the past 10 years in particular. And, you have bishops, princes, politicians, all sorts calling it, the return of the 1930s. I mean, that in itself is quite indicative of how scary this is for the establishment, because, and I think you touch on this in the book, but that's because it really does represent a rejection of their values. So not just ordinary people saying, please tweak the economic system, please improve this service, please give us a better pay packet, but actually is about undercutting value. So the stakes in this are incredibly high, as anti-populism itself demonstrates, I think.
It is, and I think if you compare, for example, reform, whatever you think of reform, with the Greens, the one big difference between the two, even though the Greens are forced to call themselves eco-populist, the one big difference between them is that reform almost self-consciously rejects the values of the cultural elite, most of the values of the cultural elite, whereas the Greens take the values of the cultural elites and take them a few steps further. So they're part of that cultural terrain within which the elites feel very comfortable. Whereas once you begin to challenge their values, you do feel that you haven't got an answer for that. I mean, I often find that when I ask somebody who's got affinities with the cultural elite to explain to me why you believe that diversity is so wonderful, they're at a loss, because they never had to account for their commitment to these empty phrases that they use all the time. So a bit of pressure totally unnerves them. But nevertheless, the one thing that is important, which one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is that almost everything that you hear about populism comes through the mouth of its enemies. So virtually, even, because as you probably know, people don't go around Britain saying, I'm a populist. It's not a form of self-definition. It's the other side who points the finger and talks about populist poison, or talk about kind of sort of quasi-fascist populists. So under those circumstances, the hegemonic cultural elites are still controlling the narrative about populism. And it's very, very rare when you get a systematic defense of populism, particularly by people who don't just simply touch on the surface of the issue, but go deeply into it and try to explain the fact that that all this stuff about fascism and xenophobia and nativism is really just a form of prejudice, not just against populism, but principally about democracy. And most attacks on populism are a roundabout way of trying to pathologize democratic decision making.
If you have a question about British politics, Israel, Iran, or any of the other topics we've been discussing here on the Brendan O'Neill Show, then I would love to hear from you at my upcoming Q&A event. The Q&A will take place live over Zoom on Tuesday, the 9th of June, and is exclusive to Spike supporters. That means if you're already a supporter, you can sign up for your free ticket right now by clicking the link below. And if you're not yet a supporter, why not become one right now? Follow the link in the description and get yourself access to exclusive or discounted tickets to all our events, plus unlimited access to the Spiked website. I hope as many of you as possible will join me at the live Q&A next month, and I look forward to answering all your questions there. See you then. A good point about who's making the running in terms of what populism means and how it's represented in the media. Although I've got a T-shirt now that says Zionist, so I might get a T-shirt that says populist as well. do the whole whammy. I wanted to touch on the issue of nostalgia, because you write in the book basically in defense of nostalgia, or you certainly look at the way in which nostalgia is now seen as this really problematic emotion. I mean, nostalgia's for quite some time been seen as a pathology and potentially even as a sickness, and this kind of this dangerous pining for a golden era. I think I probably would have been quite critical of certain forms of nostalgia in the past, certainly to the extent that they were effectively a block on changing society in the present, because you kind of spend your whole time living in the past. But your defense of nostalgia in the book is really interesting, and give us a sense of why you think it's okay that people feel nostalgic, or what nostalgia represents in the populist moment.
I think I mean, nostalgia is a very interesting phenomenon because, as you say, everybody deprecates nostalgia. There's something wrong with nostalgic people, and we have this image of these old men and old women, who go on and on and on about something that happened 50 years ago. But nostalgia, seen in its proper perspective, in the way that it influences people's life, in the way that people experience life, represents an attempt to maintain a degree of continuity with the past. And maintaining continuity with the past is really, really very, very important, not because we just want to live in the past, but because we have to take bits of the past with us if we're going to make sense of the present. And in many respects, the pressures to detach our communities and people from their historical heritage, the pressure to basically to turn the past into pathology, is very dangerous, because what it then does is that it leaves us uprooted. It prevents us from having any kind of organic connection with place and with people. So for me, nostalgia it provides is a way in which people think, and the way that people remember, and the way that in which people hold on to those threads of community that are essential if they're going to make their way in the present. And that's why, instead of being defensive and say, oh, no, we're not nostalgic, we have to explain that nostalgia is not just simply people fantasizing a world that never existed in the way that it's often presented, but on the contrary, it's very much about taking the world from the past with us into the present.
Yeah, I wanted to ask actually specifically about cultural continuity, because you have a chapter towards the end called Championing Cultural Continuity. And I did want to ask you what that means, what that embodies. I mean, some listeners will be familiar with the fact that both you and I come from a bit of a radical political tradition, kind of a left tradition. So it's interesting to see you now talking about cultural continuity, the importance of that. You also talk in the book about the failure of conservatism, especially after the 60s, to defend some of these traditions and some of these values in our societies. And I think that rings very true. Are you surprised to have found yourself in a position where you're writing about the importance of cultural continuity? And and what does that mean for you in this kind of populist moment? Why is that so central, do you think, to this idea?
Well, before I answer that, it's important to remember that historically, left and right-wing writers took the question of cultural continuity seriously. They understood that revolutions are not made out of thin air. They understood that people are inspired by events that have preceded them, and that people's wisdom is based upon the accomplishment of people that preceded them. It's only in recent times that the left in particular has become so hostile to cultural continuity and always seeks to rupture our connection with our predecessors, with our parents and grandparents, and with our past. And I think that there is that danger now that if we go along with this attempt to detach our existence from what preceded us, then we become entirely unmoored, entirely uprooted, and invariably lose our way, because one of the most important things that binds us together, that gives a basis for solidarity, is the fact that we understand that we've come from a very similar place. We have a very similar heritage that makes sense to us. And that heritage is something that, of course, we need to renew. And the act of renewal is really important. I mean, renewal, conserving the past, and renewing our existence go hand in hand. But if you don't have this element of continuity, this organic connection with what happened beforehand, then renewal is not possible. What happens is just we kind of invent things in the way that our elites are doing at the moment, where we invent values that are what I call administrative values, that was almost the product of brainstorming rather than of any organic connection with what went on beforehand. So in that sense, cultural continuity gives us the strength to be able to function in the present, and gives us the strength to be able to innovate, because innovation is very much linked to rescuing what has gone on beforehand. So in that sense, cultural continuity is the prerequisite for a community to have genuine solidarity rather than Potemkin paper solidarity.
Yeah, if you tear people from their heritage and their history and make them fearful of the future, then you just lock them in the prison of the now, the present, the kind of they get lost, they have no sense of why they're here, where they're going. I think that's really important. Frank, my last question for you is on democracy. And you talk in the book about how everyone pays lip service to democracy, but actually it's been looked upon with wariness for a very long time, right back to, ancient Greece. It was always seen as something that was potentially dangerous and problematic. You talk in the book about how the anti-populist mission of the technocratic classes is actually often a way for them to be anti-democratic without saying I'm anti-democratic, which I think is a really important observation. But you talk about how the rediscovery of voice could give new meaning to democracy. And I wonder what you think that might look like, or what form you might think that will take, because I think a lot of people will agree with your point in the book that democracy needs an injection of meaning, of a real sense of purpose. How might that come about, and why do you think that's democracy is such an important part of the populist moment?
I think that the populism is really about democracy, in the sense of it represents democracy in action. But democracy isn't just simply a procedure to do with voting and elections. That's an important element in that. But democracy is really about the role of the people, of the demos within society, how seriously it's able to represent itself, how seriously it is taken. And what populism does is it actually mobilizes people and awakens people and gives people the confidence to open their mouth, and instead of censoring themselves, to communicate their aspiration. So in that sense, the populism becomes this engine of democracy in the way that it is working at the moment. And this is really important, because at the moment, the dominant view of democracy, for what people learn in school, and it's what you read in the papers, is I believe in democracy, but, and what comes after the but is usually but there's a danger that the majority will undermine the way of life of the minority. There's a danger that democracy carried too far will become irrational. So democracy is okay as long as it's limited and as long as it's curbed and as long as we control it. But the minute you let the genie out of the bottle and people run with democracy, that's when the danger sets in. And what populism does is it encourages the genie to crawl out of the bottle and give democracy this incredible power over society. And we're seeing that. I mean, one of the unnoticed phenomena that's really quite important is that since the populist surge, you'll find that the number of people who are voting in elections has actually gone up. It's often not noticed. People often say, oh, populism means that people stay at home and it's just a small minority. But on the contrary, when people get excited about Brexit, that they go out and they vote and they feel that the outcome of this referendum is their own property. It's something that they've crafted and they've created. It's a feeling that they very rarely get, but once you get that feeling, it creates an appetite for even more. And that's a nice thing about democracy. Once you get the appetite for democratic decision making, it does become much more real than when it's handed down to you from above in the way that sort of elite technocratic politics operate.
Frank, thank you very much.
Pleasure.